Recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the comments from my colleague, Mr. Trott, on the Comprehensive Regulatory Review Act. And let me also start off by thanking my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who've been working very closely with us to make this a bipartisan bill. I think they realize that government often doesn't get it right the first time, and it takes a lot of work to get it right over time. And it's an ever-evolving process. I remember my daughter was doing a presentation years ago, and I was in the state legislature, and she said, "Dad, I want to do a presentation on leadership." And so she said, "I've decided to focus on the importance of continuing to lead, not just establishing a rule or regulation once, but continue to work on it." And so she did this presentation, and she brought up several outdated laws, even in the state of Georgia. One of them I particularly remember was, and just so anyone visiting Georgia realizes this, it is illegal to walk down the street with an ice cream cone in your back pocket. It was actually a law on the books in the state of Georgia. That prompted me to go back and start looking at some of the laws we had on the book, and I remember I was in the technology industry, and we found out that some of the telecommunications companies were still having to submit reports on their Morse code stations and teletypes. And there weren't any. And so we started looking at why were they putting that report, and they said because it's still on the books as a requirement, but the regulators have never gone back and reviewed it and took that off. And we taught the regulators, say, why? I said, look, we're too busy doing our regulation to go and do this. So we passed legislation to remove it. Now, in 1996, Congress, I think, took a pretty good step, Mr. Chairman. They passed the Economic Growth and Regulatory Paperwork Reduction Act, which basically said, look, every 10 years you need to go and review your regulations, and if there's any duplicative regulations or those that are outdated, you need to report those back to Congress. But we really just lacked a little bit of teeth in there saying you really need to do more than just check the box. You need to look at the regulations and let's get rid of those regulations that are duplicative. Let's not force people to report on things that they're not doing. And let's take it a step further, and this is what we're doing, and the regulation is just saying, let's broaden that to all these financial regulators. Let's include the CFPB, and let's also give them the opportunity to tailor regulations instead of painting with a broad brush. I think that's a pretty reasonable way of doing business. I think that's a very effective way of doing business, that we can let the regulators focus on regulating in the areas that are important and imperative, and not just regulate based on an arcane regulation that happens to be in the book that no one's taking the time to review. So, Mr. George, can you briefly explain, why AGRIPA really provides a good basis for cleaning up these duplicative regulations, but from what I've heard, I assume that you would like to see it strengthened. What do you think is positive, and why we should strengthen it?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, listen, think about this. In 2006 versus 2016, the lending environment is wildly different. We're on a different planet. In 2006, CFPB didn't exist, TRID didn't exist, HVCC didn't exist, LOCOMP, Dodd-Frank, all of those rules did not exist. If we are going to say we're going to wait another 10 years to look at a change, I think that really harms our industry. I think that we're far better off taking a look at this on a 5-year period of time, to be able to see whether or not we have accidentally created a rule that stifles either innovation or competition, which is what we're trying to fix with 2570. In my opinion, when you're talking about brokers and lenders that are side by side, two offices next to one another, and the broker loses a transaction simply because his loan is calculated different, not disclosed different, just calculated different, those are the kinds of things that we have to revisit and look at. I'm not, Congressman Trott said something. He said it's, the things of price and oversight of regulation are true, but let me tell you something. What keeps this industry honest is competition. You put more players in this thing, they're going to compete hard to get that transaction. It's hard.
And I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, the American Bankers Association agree with Mr. George and myself in a letter that they have provided in support of the Comprehensive Regulatory Review Act. And I'd like to submit that for the official record, if that's possible.
Without objection.
Thank you. New voice in the chair there. And I think this is, and I know there are people out there that's never met a regulation that they didn't like. But if you really drill down to the regulators, they, just like the business, are looking at stability. I think we can give, we're putting them in the driver's seat to
Chairman?
clean their own house.
Will
And
the
so with that,
gentleman
I yield
yield?
back.
Will the gentleman yield?